January 1945. Deep inside the frozen Ardennes forest, 5 American Army nurses vanished without a trace. No wreckage, no radio signal, no survivors. For weeks, even the U.S. Army believed they were dead. But when General George S. Patton finally entered a hidden manor buried beneath the snow, he discovered something far worse than death waiting inside. The women were still alive, but the fear in their eyes told a story no battlefield report could ever explain. What Patton saw that day changed him forever. Because this was no longer just a war between armies. It became a battle over human dignity itself. And what happened next would become one of the most disturbing and emotional moments of Patton's entire wartime career. January 1945. The Ardennes forest looked less like Earth and more like a graveyard buried under snow. Trees stood frozen and black against the gray sky. Burned tanks rested beside narrow roads like giant steel skeletons. Every breath hurt. Every step through the snow sounded louder than it should. The men of the Third Army had stopped talking much during those weeks. Cold weather did that to people. So did war. Somewhere near the Belgian village of Houffalize, a medical convoy from the 12th Evacuation Hospital disappeared without a trace. 2 ambulances, 1 supply truck, 5 Army nurses, 12 enlisted men, gone. At first, headquarters assumed the convoy had been destroyed during the German counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge had turned entire roads into death traps. Vehicles vanished every day. Sometimes there was nothing left to recover except burned tires frozen into the ice. But this convoy was different. No wreckage was found. No bodies. No radio call. Nothing. That silence began to spread through the American lines faster than artillery fire. Soldiers whispered about it while warming their hands over weak camp stoves. Some believed the nurses had escaped into the forest. Others believed they had been captured by retreating SS units hiding in the hills. Nobody wanted to say the darker possibility out loud. Lieutenant Mary Sullivan had been the lead nurse of the convoy, 29 years old, Boston-born, calm under pressure. The kind of woman who could stitch a wounded soldier together while shells exploded outside the tent walls. Men respected her because she never panicked. 3 weeks before the convoy vanished, Mary had written a letter home to her younger brother. "War teaches you strange things," she wrote. "Where? You learn how valuable kindness becomes when the whole world forgets how to be human." The letter arrived in Boston 2 days after she disappeared. Far behind the front lines, General George S. Patton continued pushing his army east through the frozen landscape. Patton was many things: loud, aggressive, proud. But beneath the polished helmet and ivory-handled revolvers was a man obsessed with discipline and military honor. To Patton, medics and nurses were sacred. Not because they wore uniforms, because they walked into hell without carrying hatred in their hands. They carried bandages instead. One snowy morning, intelligence officers brought Patton a report from Belgian civilians near the forest edge. Strange movements had been seen around an old manor house, hidden several miles beyond the village roads. Trucks arriving at night, armed guards. Smoke rising from chimneys even during artillery bombardments. The civilians also claimed they heard women screaming several nights earlier. The room went silent after the report was read. Patton removed his gloves slowly. "Who controls the estate?" he asked. "Possible SS command element, sir." Patton stared at the map for several seconds. Then he said something none of the officers in the room forgot afterward. "War is ugly enough already," he muttered quietly. "God help them if they cross the line." The next morning, elements of the 4th Armored Division advanced through the forest toward the estate. Snow fell heavily as Sherman tanks crushed frozen branches beneath their tracks. Infantrymen moved carefully between the trees with rifles ready. Nobody knew what waited ahead. The deeper they pushed into the woods, the stranger things became. No gunfire, no patrols, no resistance, just silence. Then finally, through the falling snow, the soldiers saw it. A massive stone manor house, standing alone among the pines. Dark windows, iron gates, smoke, drifting from the chimney into the pale winter sky. One young private whispered something under his breath when he noticed lights glowing behind the curtains. The war outside looked dead, but inside that house, someone was still living comfortably, and every man there suddenly felt the same thing crawling up his spine. Something was very wrong inside those walls. Something was very wrong inside those walls. The soldiers of the 4th Armored Division felt it. The moment the iron gates creaked open, no machine gun fire greeted them, no desperate German counterattack, no shouting. Only the sound of boots pressing into snow and the distant crackling of wood burning somewhere inside the manor. Captain Ellis motioned his men forward carefully, rifles raised, eyes locked on every dark window. One nervous private kicked open the front door, expecting bullets to explode through the hallway. Nothing happened. The air inside felt warm, too warm. The smell hit them first. Expensive tobacco, roast meat, wine, coal smoke. It felt impossible. Outside, men were freezing to death in foxholes. Entire villages had been reduced to rubble. But inside this mansion, somebody had been living like the war was happening on another planet. The chandelier above the entrance hall still glowed softly. A piano sat untouched near the staircase. One soldier muttered quietly, "Jesus Christ!" Then they heard footsteps upstairs. The men moved quickly through the corridors. Room after room appeared untouched by combat. Velvet curtains, crystal glasses, half-finished meals still sitting on silver trays. And then they found them, 5 American nurses standing together inside a narrow hallway near the back of the house. Nobody spoke at first. Lieutenant Mary Sullivan looked thinner than her army photograph. Her cheeks had hollowed slightly. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. One of the younger nurses trembled so badly she could barely hold herself upright. Another stared blankly at the floor, as if her mind had traveled somewhere far away just to survive. But they were alive. That alone stunned the soldiers into silence. A medic stepped forward carefully. "It's okay now," he whispered. "You're safe." Mary tried to answer, but her voice cracked before words came out. One of the nurses suddenly began crying, not loudly, just quietly. Exhausted tears from someone who had held fear inside for too long. The soldiers looked around the hallway. No chains, no blood, no visible signs of violence. And somehow, that made everything feel worse. Because every man there understood the same thing at the same moment. Whatever happened inside this house had been controlled, deliberate, calm. Not chaos, choice. Downstairs, another patrol entered the manor's main study. That was where they found SS Sturmbannführer Klaus Richter. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk with a glass of red wine resting calmly beside his hand. Even as American rifles pointed directly at his chest, Richter barely reacted. He wore a perfectly pressed black uniform, silver's insignia polished, boots spotless. Like a man attending dinner instead of losing a war. He slowly raised his eyes toward the American soldiers. "You Americans are late," he said in fluent English. One private nearly pulled the trigger right there. Captain Ellis shoved the rifle barrel downward before the shot could fire. Richter leaned back comfortably in his chair. "I assume," he continued coldly, "that I will now be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Nobody answered him. The hatred inside the room had become too heavy for words. Several hours later, General George S. Patton arrived at the manor personally after receiving the initial field report. Snow still fell around the estate as his jeep rolled through the gates. Patton stepped out slowly, his polished helmet reflecting the pale winter light. The soldiers standing outside looked tense, angry, disturbed. Patton noticed immediately. "What did you find?" he asked. Captain Ellis hesitated before answering. "You should see it yourself, sir." Patton entered the manor without another word. The moment he walked inside, he understood why the men looked shaken. The warmth of the mansion felt unnatural, offensive almost. Like comfort itself had become something dirty inside those walls. Then he saw the nurses. Patton removed his gloves slowly. Mary Sullivan looked at him, but could barely hold eye contact. Her posture remained military straight, but the fear behind her exhausted eyes told a story no official report ever could. Patton said nothing for several seconds. Then his gaze shifted toward the study doors, where Klaus Richter waited calmly under armed guard. The old general's face hardened instantly. Not rage, something colder than rage. The kind of silence that comes when a man realizes another human being no longer deserves the honor of being called a soldier. 4. The kind of silence that comes when a man realizes another human being no longer deserves the honor of being called a soldier. General George S. 4. Patton stood in the center of the manor's study without speaking. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace behind Klaus Richter. 4. Shadows moved across the walls as snow continued falling outside the tall windows. For a few long seconds, neither man moved. Richter finally broke the silence first. "I assume," he said calmly, "that I am now a prisoner of war under American protection." Patton looked at him carefully. Not with anger, with disappointment. That somehow felt worse. 4. The old general slowly walked around the room. His boots pressed against thick Persian rugs while he studied the untouched luxury surrounding them. Shelves full of books, crystal glasses, warm food still sitting near the fire. Meanwhile, less than 10 miles away, American soldiers were sleeping in frozen foxholes with bloody socks wrapped around their feet because winter boots had run out weeks earlier. Patton stopped near the fireplace. "How long were the nurses held here?" he asked quietly. Richter lifted his chin slightly. "They were treated adequately." One American sergeant cursed under his breath. "Frou." Another looked ready to cross the room and beat Richter with the butt of his rifle. Patton raised one hand without turning around. The room became still again. Then he asked a second question. "Did you force them to serve you?" Richter smirked faintly. "They performed duties suitable for captives." That answer changed something in the room. The air itself seemed heavier afterward. Patton turned slowly toward him. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes had gone cold as frozen steel. "You wore that uniform," Patton said quietly, "and still forgot what honor means." Richter gave a small shrug. "Honor does not win wars, General." Patton stared at him for several seconds. Then he answered with a voice so calm it unsettled every man standing nearby. "No, but without honor, winning stops mattering." Outside the study, Mary Sullivan sat beside the staircase wrapped in a military blanket. A medic cleaned a cut near her hand, while another nurse stared silently at the floorboards. None of them still spoke much. Trauma had drained the words out of them. 4. Patton stepped into the hallway briefly and looked at the women again. That was when he noticed something that stayed with him forever. None of the nurses looked relieved. Safe, yes. Alive, yes. But not relieved. Fear was still sitting inside them, not fear of death. Fear that the man in the study still somehow held power over them. Patton had seen that expression before. He had seen it in liberated towns across Europe. Civilians who survived occupation often carried invisible chains long after the enemy was gone. A soldier could survive bullets. But humiliation stayed inside people. That realization followed Patton back into the study. Richter still sat comfortably behind the desk, still acting like a man protected by rank and law and status. And suddenly, Patton understood the real problem. If Richter left this house untouched in spirit, then the nurses would carry this nightmare for the rest of their lives, while he preserved his pride behind barbed wire in some officer prison camp. Patton hated many things: cowardice, arrogance, cruelty. But more than anything, he hated men who used power against people unable to fight back. Because to Patton, strength was supposed to protect weakness, not feed on it. He walked closer to Richter until only inches separated them. "You think your rank protects you," Patton said softly. "It does," Richter replied immediately. "Civilized armies follow civilized rules." Patton nodded once. "Yes," he said, "they do." Then his voice hardened. "But civilized men also understand limits." Richter's confident expression flickered for the first time, only slightly. But Patton noticed it. For the next several moments, the general said nothing else. He simply stared at the SS officer as if measuring him, studying where the man's pride truly lived. Then Patton turned toward the guards near the doorway. "Bring him outside," he ordered. The soldiers grabbed Richter immediately. Under what authority? Richter snapped angrily as they pulled him from the chair. Patton looked back one final time. "The authority," he answered coldly, "of a man who still remembers the difference between power and decency." As Richter was dragged toward the snowy courtyard, Patton reached into a nearby supply kit resting against the wall. From inside it, he removed a pair of heavy steel shears. And when Mary Sullivan saw them in his hands, she realized this was no longer going to be an ordinary military punishment. And when Mary Sullivan saw them in his hands, she realized this was no longer going to be an ordinary military punishment. The courtyard outside the manor was covered in half-frozen mud. Snow fell in slow, quiet flakes, landing on helmets, shoulders, rifles, and the dark stones of the old estate. The men of the 4th Armored Division stood in a wide circle, not because anyone ordered them to enjoy what was about to happen, but because Patton wanted witnesses. He wanted every man there to understand something. This was not revenge for revenge's sake. This was a lesson. Klaus Richter was pushed into the center of the courtyard. For the first time since the Americans had entered the house, his composure began to crack. His black uniform was still perfect. His polished boots still shined. His medal still rested proudly on his chest. But now he was standing in the mud, and the mud did not respect rank. Patton stepped forward and held the steel shears at his side. Then he turned toward Mary Sullivan. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, "step forward." Mary did not move at first. Her hands were wrapped inside a wool blanket. Her face was pale from cold, hunger, and weeks of fear that no person should have to carry. One of the younger nurses looked at her, silently begging her not to go. But Mary slowly stood. Each step she took through the snow seemed heavy, not because she was weak, but because courage often feels heavy before it feels strong. Patton handed her the shears. Richter immediately understood. "No," he snapped. "You cannot do this. I am an officer." Patton looked at him without blinking. "You stopped being one when you forgot the first duty of power." Richter's face twisted with anger. "My rank is protected." Patton nodded slightly. "Your life is protected. Your pride is not." The courtyard went silent. Mary stared at the medals on Richter's chest. Her hands trembled as she raised the shears. For a moment, she could not do it. The fear was still there, the memory of that house, the sound of his voice, the way he had made every room feel smaller. Patton saw her struggle, so he spoke gently but firmly. "Take back what he made you believe was gone." Mary swallowed hard. Then the first cut came. A sharp metallic snap broke the silence. One silver insignia fell from Richter's collar and disappeared into the mud. Nobody cheered. Nobody laughed. That mattered. Because this was not entertainment. It was not cruelty. It was a public reminder that symbols only have meaning when the person wearing them deserves them. Mary cut another piece from the uniform. Then another. The SS markings, the shoulder straps, the polished decorations that Richter had used like armor for his ego. One by one, they dropped into the frozen dirt. Richter began shouting about international law, about officer rights, about civilized conduct. Patton let him speak. Then he said, "Civilization begins with how a strong man treats someone who cannot fight him." That sentence landed harder than any slap could have. The other nurses stepped forward next. Once, slowly, carefully. One removed a ribbon from Richter's chest as another cut away a decorative cord from his shoulder. A third picked up an insignia from the mud and dropped it into a shallow hole near his feet. With every piece removed, Richter seemed to shrink. Not physically, something deeper. The image he had built around himself began to collapse. He had believed the uniform made him untouchable. He had believed fear was the same as respect. He had believed power could replace honor. But now, in front of American soldiers, Belgian civilians, and the women he had tried to break, he was becoming what he had always been beneath the symbols. A frightened man hiding inside a costume. Patton pointed to the fallen medals. "Pick them up," he ordered. Richter refused. Two soldiers stepped forward, but Patton raised a hand to stop them. "No," Patton said. "He will do it himself." For several seconds, Richter stood still. Then slowly, shaking with rage, he bent down into the mud and gathered the pieces of his own identity. His fingers sank into the cold earth. Snow melted against his sleeves. His polished boots were now stained brown. Patton pointed to the shallow hole. "Bury them." Richter looked up at him, with hatred. Patton's voice stayed calm. "You worshipped those symbols. Now learn what happens when symbols lose their soul." Richter dropped the medals into the hole. Then he covered them with mud. No band played, no speech followed, only silence. Mary Sullivan watched the last piece disappear beneath the earth. Her breathing changed. It was small, almost impossible to notice. But Patton noticed. For the first time since he had entered the manor, her shoulders lowered. Not fully, not enough to erase what happened. Nothing could do that. But something inside her had shifted. The man who had filled that house with fear was no longer standing above her. He was kneeling in the same mud as the lies he had lived by. One of the younger nurses began to cry. This time no one told her to be strong, because strength is not the absence of tears. Sometimes strength is finally feeling safe enough to let them fall. Patton turned away from Richter and looked at his own men. "Remember this," he said. "A uniform does not make a man honorable. Rank does not make him decent. And victory means nothing if we forget why we are fighting." The soldiers stood quietly in the falling snow. They had seen tanks burn before. They had seen towns collapse. They had seen death in more forms than any man should know. But that day, in that frozen courtyard, they learned a different kind of lesson. War can destroy buildings, it can destroy armies, it can destroy borders. But the most dangerous war is the one that tries to destroy human dignity. And once dignity is taken, the first step toward healing is not always revenge. Sometimes it is simply watching fear lose its uniform. And once dignity is taken, the first step toward healing is not always revenge. Sometimes it is simply watching fear lose its uniform. The snow finally stopped sometime before dawn. By morning, the manor house stood silent beneath a pale gray sky. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys. American vehicles filled the courtyard, where SS guards had once walked with confidence. Klaus Richter sat in the back of a military transport truck wrapped in a wool blanket that did little to hide what remained of his humiliation. His uniform had been stripped bare. No medals. No insignia. No symbols left to protect the illusion he once lived behind. The soldiers guarding him barely looked at him anymore. That was the cruelest part. Fear had turned into pity. And pity destroys proud men faster than hatred ever will. As the convoy prepared to leave, Mary Sullivan stood near the manor gates beside the other nurses. Army doctors wanted them transferred immediately to a rear medical station for evaluation and rest. But before leaving, Mary quietly watched the truck carrying Richter disappear down the frozen road between the trees. One of the younger nurses spoke softly beside her. "Do you think he understands what he became?" Mary looked at the tire tracks fading into the snow. "No," she answered after a long pause. "Men like him usually don't." Then she pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "But maybe that's why history has to remember." Far away from the manor, reports about the incident slowly moved through military channels. Officers rewrote details. Certain descriptions disappeared from official paperwork. The Army preferred clean records, organized records, simple records. War rarely gives anyone that luxury. General George S. Patton understood that better than most men alive. Several days later, Patton sat alone inside a temporary headquarters office, reviewing casualty reports by lantern light. Outside, artillery thunder echoed faintly across the distant hills. The war was still moving east, still consuming lives every hour. But his mind kept returning to the manor, not because of Richter, but because of the nurses. Patton had seen wounded soldiers recover from terrible injuries before. Missing limbs, burn scars, bullet wounds. Men could survive horrifying things when given enough time and purpose. But invisible wounds were different. Those stayed quiet, and quiet pain was often the hardest pain to heal. He removed his gloves slowly and stared at his hands resting on the desk. Hands that had directed tanks across Europe. Hands that had signed orders sending thousands of men into battle. Hands that had built a reputation feared across 2 continents. Yet none of that power had prepared him for the look in Mary Sullivan's eyes when he first entered that hallway. That haunted him. Or, because deep down, Patton understood something many commanders never admitted out loud. War does not only test courage, it tests morality. Every day, every decision, for every moment, a human being is given power over another human being. That was the real battlefield most people never saw. A young aide entered the room quietly with fresh documents. Before leaving, the lieutenant hesitated. "Sir," he asked carefully, "do you think what happened at the manor was justice?" Patton leaned back slowly. For once, the old general did not answer immediately. Finally, he spoke in a tired voice. "I think," he said, "that civilization survives only when decent people refuse to become comfortable with cruelty." The lieutenant nodded silently. Patton continued speaking, almost as if thinking out loud now. "The dangerous thing about evil isn't always violence. Sometimes it's pride, the belief that power makes you untouchable." He looked back toward the window, and once a man believes that, he can justify anything. The room fell quiet again. Months later, the war in Europe finally ended. Cities celebrated. Soldiers returned home. Headlines filled newspapers across America. Victory photographs captured smiling faces beneath waving flags. But some stories never reached the papers. The manor in the Ardennes became one of them. Mary Sullivan eventually returned to Boston. She continued nursing for many years afterward. According to those who knew her, she rarely spoke about the war publicly. But one sentence from an interview, decades later, survived in a small veterans archive. She said, "The day we were rescued, I learned something important. Human dignity can be wounded, but it only truly dies when people stop defending it." That lesson mattered far beyond one frozen courtyard in Belgium, because history is filled with powerful men wearing uniforms, titles, medals, and flags. But time eventually strips all those things away. What remains is how they treated people when they had power over them. That is the part history never forgets. And maybe that is why stories like this still matter today. Not because they remind us how brutal war can become, but because they remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, dignity is still worth protecting.